Hello everyone, and welcome to Chapter 6. Chapter 6 deals with source factors, and one of the most influential aspects of persuasion deals with the source of the persuasive message. So a source can be a person or an individual who's actually delivering a speech or some kind of a public demonstration of some sort. Sources may also be based on the television or the radio or internet, right? So sometimes the source might be a company, and they may use several individuals within a commercial or within a presentation or vignette to try to demonstrate the main point they're trying to get across to persuade us to do something. But it cannot be emphasized enough how important source factors are in our ability to persuade an audience. And so this chapter is going to look at many of the different attributes that go into source factors that will give someone a sense of believability, a sense of credibility or authority on a given topic. And so hopefully some of these issues or some of these ideas you have yourself experienced already in life, right? So you can think back to some of the most powerful persuasive speeches or presentations that you have heard or that you have experienced, and you can hopefully draw a correlation or a connection between some of the things that you had found to be persuasive in being a listener in the past and some of the things that are mentioned in the book. So obviously learning about different source factors can be an asset when trying to persuade people, because if we know the various aspects that go into how it is that people evaluate various sources for credibility, persuasion, and things like that, then of course we can work to bolster our own credibility, authority, and social attractiveness as source factors that will enhance our ability to persuade others. So let's get started. Charisma. What is charisma? Do you have charisma? Do you know someone who has charisma? Have you experienced being on the receiving end of speech and or communication by someone who does have a good amount of charisma? The idea of charisma was first coined by a German sociologist by the name of Max Weber. Max Weber suggested that charisma is a certain type of a quality, an innate quality that an individual person has just by virtue of who they are. And that innate quality sets them apart from the average individual, okay? And because of charisma, individuals who have it, they tend to also be capable of exercising more influence over people than individuals who do not have charisma. So a lot of times you might hear somebody say, when maybe you're watching a teacher or some kind of a student give a public speech, or maybe a certain actor or actress, and you might hear someone say, wow, they have a lot of charisma or a lot of stage presence, right? So charisma is something that tends to exist or doesn't exist in people. It's not typically something that you can try to work to cultivate. You can certainly enhance your attractiveness level and try to enhance your competence and things like that as a speaker. But charisma is just some innate quality that some people maintain or have, which basically makes other people just want to pay attention to them. And because of that innate ability, or the perception that they're able to create about having some kind of innate exceptional power or ability, people are more likely to listen to them and to want to listen and want to potentially be influenced by those who have charisma. So we can look at the course of history and we can see that there are many individuals, even here just in the United States, that we have had, let's say, in a political sphere, who have charisma. So John F. Kennedy was identified as someone who had a lot of charisma. We can look at people like Bill Clinton and Ronald Reagan. They also had a lot of charisma. Even President Barack Obama has been identified as having a lot of charisma. You can also look at people like Nelson Mandela or Gandhi in the international area in terms of human rights. And because of the charisma that all of these individuals had, they were able to influence mass populations to want to listen to their message and to want to behave in ways that aligned with what their message was. Charisma has also been utilized, unfortunately, by people who have had more of a negative role in history. So somebody like Adolf Hitler had a lot of charisma, right? And if you actually watch some of his speeches, except for that some of the interesting stylistic design issues that he has with his, military outfit and his mustache and things like that, when you actually listen to him speak, you can see, and when you watch the interplay between Adolf Hitler speaking and the audience reacting, you can see that they are definitely connected with him, and they definitely feel that he has some kind of exceptional power or ability. People who have charisma have also been responsible for negative outcomes in terms of occult type behavior. So we can look at people such as Charles Manson or Jim Jones, who actually, if you can believe it, convinced 900 people to commit suicide because he had, some ideas about the end of the world and, what was happening there. There was also David Koresh, who was a leader of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas. And then we can look at someone like Marshall Applewhite, who actually led 38 members of his Heaven's Gate cult to commit suicide in 1997. And, all of these people, even if they do look a little bit strange, they did maintain or hold this idea of charisma, okay? And because of this charisma, they were able to influence people in a very powerful way. So clearly, charisma is something that is worth paying attention to and being aware of in society, and of course in our own persuasive interactions with other people, both in terms of how we are persuaded, but also how we could potentially help persuade other people. Charisma has been something that has been identified as having a powerful influence over people, and so individuals who have charisma tend to be more capable of evoking crowds or mass audiences to listen to them, and again, to behave in ways that go along with their agenda. So charisma is really something that takes place as an interplay between the leader and followers. You might have charisma in your day-to-day interactions, right? But the influence of charisma in terms of mass populations and large groups of people is a much more powerful influence there, okay? So certainly individuals who have charisma may be more influential and may be able to persuade people more effectively in their day-to-day one-on-one interactions with people. But in terms of charisma, we're especially interested in looking at this concept with regards to individuals who have had an impact over large groups of people or mass audiences. Other source characteristics that are very influential in persuasion deal with things like authority. And authority is basically the idea that somebody above you is capable of distributing rewards or punishments. Certainly, the effect of authority has been very influential in the past in terms of different types of events in history. So, for example, your book actually talks about the situation of the Holocaust, and they talked about Gordon Allport was a researcher, and he sought to try to make sense of how it is that the people that were underneath Adolf Hitler actually were willing to follow through with the plans and to implement the plans that actually ended up being responsible for the extermination of 6 million Jews. So an individual who was one of Adolf's lead men, his name was Eichmann, he said after the Holocaust, when he was on trial for the Holocaust and for his participation, he said, quote, "It was unthinkable that I would not follow orders." Okay, so this idea of authority is very powerful, and it tends to sometimes make people do things that they ordinarily wouldn't do, and it's probably also because they have someone that they feel that they can defer the decision to. So if I say to you, well, I don't want to do this, but I'm being ordered to do this by someone who's above me, then that actually allows me to minimize my own responsibility for behaving in ways that could be unethical, right? Or even in this case with Eichmann, behaving in really atrocious ways towards humanity, right? So we think about authority, we think about rewards and punishments. There was another study that was done later that was conducted by Milgram, and this was done at Yale University between 1960 and 1963, and it was a very similar outcome. We're going to talk about the Milgram experiment later on in this lecture, but it was a very similar situation as I referenced just a few moments ago with Eichmann in the Holocaust, where you had very ordinary people, good people, normal people, upstanding citizens in society, and they were brought into a lab, and they were put in a situation where they were being told by someone who was, positioned as the authority member that they had to deliver an electric shock to the person on the receiving end, right? Based on some kind of a learning game that they were doing. And so Milgram actually was able to replicate and to, reestablish the fact that authority causes people to do things that are really terrible to other human beings just because there's somebody that they perceive as above them that is telling them to do so. And this person above them, of course, could potentially distribute rewards or punishments. So it's always good to think about how much credibility or how much power we're giving someone in terms of their persuadability or persuasive potential based on their authority. Credibility is also something that's very important in terms of persuasion, and I'm sure that you think a lot about credibility as students because you're dealing mostly with educational situations. You have to deal with different professors, and I'm sure that there are many different types of situations in your life where you get an opportunity to evaluate someone based on their credibility, right? And so credibility basically deals with whether we think someone knows what they say that they're supposed to know, whether we think they're an expert on the topic, and whether we feel like they're someone that we should even be listening to about that given topic. And credibility is very important in terms of being an effective persuader. Finally, we're going to look at social attractiveness, and social attractiveness is also something that tends to influence persuasiveness because it's been found in the research that people who are attractive tend to be also more persuasive. So when you think back to all of the individuals who we talked about at the beginning of our lecture here today, who had a lot of charisma, right? Most of those people who have charisma also tend to be attractive. Now, I have met people who are very attractive that do not have any charisma, but attractiveness and charisma also, they tend to go hand in hand usually. No, but the other thing about attractiveness is social attractiveness does not deal only with physical attractiveness. There are lots of other aspects to that, and so we're going to get into what some of those are in this lecture today. So let's get going on looking at some of these issues in more detail. Authority. As I stated before, perceptions of authority influence whether someone is persuasive or not. In the Milgram experiments that were conducted at Yale University, it was a very interesting situation because the researcher, Milgram, was able to establish that decent, good human beings who are upstanding members of society are able and willing to commit what he called crimes of obedience because an authority member or an authority individual was telling them to do so. So basically what they did is in this experiment is they brought an individual into the lab, and the individual who was brought into the lab was offered $4.50 to complete the experiment. And this was in 1960, so obviously it was more money than it is now. But basically the person who was brought into the lab was told that they were going to engage in a learning game or a learning process with someone who was on the other side of the wall, okay? So the person that they brought into the lab was not aware of the purpose of the study. And so then they had another individual who was on the other side of the wall, and the other individual was an actor who was basically acting when the electric shocks were delivered by the person who was the subject, okay? So the person who did not know the point of the study was the subject, and they were coached by a doctor who was in the authority position, right? He looked like a doctor. And they were told at the beginning of the study that they were going to be engaging in a learning process and that they were going to have to ask the person on the other side of the wall a series of questions. And when the person got the question wrong, that they were going to have to deliver an electric shock to the person on the other side of the wall, okay? So they ended up doing this experiment, and the electric shock intensity was going to increase. This is what they were told, okay? The subjects were told that every time the learner on the other side of the wall got a wrong answer, that the teacher, who was the subject that didn't know what the point of the study was, the teacher, were supposed to initiate between 15 to 450 volts of electric shock, okay? So they obviously started out the experiment. They had the person who was the teacher. Again, this is the subject who did not know the point of the study. Okay, and these are the people that they wanted to see, would they actually do something to inflict human suffering? And so what they have is they have the person who's the subject, and he reads a script to the person who's the learner on the other side, and the learner gets the answer wrong, and then the subject is supposed to hit a button, and then the button presumably delivers a shock to the person on the other side. Now, of course, the person who was on the other side of the wall, that was the learner, actually was an actor, and the actor was instructed to behave in ways where it would be believable that they had just received an electric shock. And as the experiment progressed, every time they got something wrong, the electric shock level would increase. Okay, so it started out at 15 volts of electricity, and then at the end, it was ending up at 450 volts of electric shock. So every time the person got something wrong, the subject, who was the teacher, was supposed to hit the button, and so they would. And they would oftentimes, as the electric shock got more and more intense, the person who was on the other side, the actor, would start to protest and would start to say, hey, this is hurting me, and I'm starting to feel sick, and I'm starting to have my heart is starting to feel weird, and I want to stop the experiment. And so the person who was the subject would look at the doctor, and they'd say, look, this guy on the other side is not feeling good. He says that he's getting hurt by the shocks. I don't want to keep doing this. And the person who was the doctor in the authority position would say something to them like, it is absolutely essential you continue. It is absolutely essential you continue. So it was a very striking study, because essentially what they found is that around 65% of people actually would continue to shock the person on the other side of the wall during the experiment, because the authority person, the person in the lab coat, would say to them, it is absolutely essential that you continue. Now, this was even the case even once the person who was being shocked started to say, it's hurting me, my heart is starting to feel weird, I think I might be having a heart attack. And then they went quiet and they stopped talking. And, presumably when someone's been getting 450 volts of electricity, surged into them, and then they suddenly stopped talking after that, who knows, right? Maybe the person had died already or had, fallen over. And yet people were still, 65% of people brought into the lab were still willing to inflict high shock, because the person in the authority position said, it is absolutely essential you continue. So this was quite a striking study. It definitely brought a lot of information forward about the importance of authority in terms of persuadability, and also about the fact that we have to be very vigilant about people who are in authority positions, so that we don't just blindly accept what they're telling us to do, but rather we should question and consider what we're doing and whether this is something that is really ethical or humanistic, right? So it was a good study to think about, and I encourage you, if you feel like you have the time, to go on the web. You can certainly Google, you can YouTube the Milgram experiments, and I think that you can find the actual experiment, and you can also find a narrative reenactment that was done as well. So if you have some time, I encourage you to watch this, so you can really get a sense of of how much human suffering was taking place, and how many of these individuals, 65% of them, were actually willing to continue shocking another human being just because somebody in a lab coat was standing over them saying, it is absolutely essential that you continue. So definitely good to think about authority in the terms of our own persuadability, right? In terms of our own ability to be persuasive. We want to think about whether we establish ourselves as an authority member in front of our speakers, right? And so there are various ways that you can establish authority. And of course, one of them deals with how you're presenting yourself, what your position is, maybe how you're dressed. But there are other nonverbal ways that people can establish authority, such as posture and how you walk and how you carry yourself. Certainly how you speak, whether you speak with a direct and powerful speaking voice, and whether you use words and language that also is appropriate for the context, right? So we'll talk about this a little bit more later, but for the course of this actual slide, it's good to take away the fact that human beings are very susceptible to blindly following authority members. And this is something that, as positive members of society, we always want to question. We always want to be vigilant of just blindly following an authority member just because they say so, right? We always want to ask ourselves, is this something that I feel that this behavior is in alignment with my own ethical moral code, rather than I'm just going to do something because somebody tells me to do it. So there have been several theorists that have attempted to try to explain why the Milgram experiment actually played out the way that it did. And so some of the things that they came up with in terms of explaining this is something like early socialization. So at a very young age, we are taught that, teachers and doctors and police officers and people like this are the people that we are supposed to obey. And there's also an inherent desire or need to trust people who are in an authority position, right? And most people who are in authority positions are probably not unethical and are probably not going to use their power for a negative outcome. But there really, is nothing to say that somebody who is in an authority position would not. And so this is why it's always a good thing to, really question things and be vigilant about the kinds of behaviors and assumptions that we might be making or accepting just because somebody who's in an authority position is telling us to do so. The listening to authority is something that's socialized in us from a very young age. And obviously when we're in, school, we are expected to pay attention and adhere to authority. When we do teamwork, like sports teams, things like that, there are also people who are in authority positions that we defer to. And even in organizations, most of us have a boss or 2 or 3 bosses that we answer to. And, the socialization component is a very important part of this idea of blindly following an authority member, right? On the other hand, part of the reason why we're in college, or you folks are in college, I'm not in college anymore technically, but part of the reason for things like college and a university experience is to cultivate a sense of critical thinking in people like yourself. And critical thinking deals with our ability to question and critically assess the information that we're receiving and to draw our own conclusions that are evidence-based, okay? So early socialization is definitely one explanation for why these kinds of human tendencies take place. We can also look at something like trappings of authority. So when we see somebody, for example, wearing a lab coat and they're wearing clothing that suggests that they are in an authority position, or we're in an institutional setting where we're perhaps in a lower power position, or even certain types of people may perceive that gender is an authority marker. So some people may perceive that men are in more authority than women. This is certainly something that can influence people's perceptions of those who are in leadership even today, even with the so-called equal status of men and women in society. Gender is certainly something that tends to still influence perceptions of authority. We can also look at things like other binding forces that may shape why it is that a human being would inflict a potentially deadly electric shock to another human being. And this deals with binding forces such as believing that perhaps there's other information that I don't have that is informing this study or that is informing this process, right? So basically the assumption that I just don't know enough about the situation to make a conclusion that's correct. And again, the whole point of looking at studies like this is to really reinforce the importance of critically thinking about the information that we receive, asking yourself questions about the agenda of the person who is delivering the message, right? And most people who are speaking or delivering any kind of a message have an agenda, and it's always useful to ask yourself, what is this person's agenda? And when you come up with an agenda, then of course you can start to look at the way that they're laying information out. You can critically assess whether the information that they're referring to is correct or whether it's perhaps speculative. You can also look at the way that people use language to attempt to persuade you, right? And these are all ways that we can critically assess different types of interests that may be seeking to persuade us in our life. Credibility. Credibility is something that we did discuss earlier on in the course already. It was a term that was coined by Aristotle, and it deals with our ability to create ethos or a perception that we are a credible source that people should listen to, okay? So credibility is basically the attitude that the audience will develop towards a given source, all right, about whether or not this person is someone that I should listen to. Now, although charisma and authority and physical attractiveness may not be so much within your control, credibility is absolutely something that we can control. And so I encourage you to use this for your benefit in your daily personal and professional lives, and also in your final presentations for this course. Establishing credibility is absolutely necessary for persuasion to take place. Credibility deals with three components. The first one of these is expertise. So does the person who is speaking, or does the organization who is presenting this campaign have the knowledge and the ability that they should have about this topic? Trustworthiness. Is this person or is this source someone or an entity that I perceive to be honest, that I perceive has good character, and that I perceive has positive, good intentions? Goodwill. Does this person have a caring and empathic perspective about the world and about the topic? Is this someone who is generally attempting to do good in the world? Or is this someone who is perceived as not having goodwill, as not being empathic and not being caring? Okay, these are all things that we want to think about in terms of establishing credibility. And obviously credibility is important. We ourselves have been influenced by other people who have credibility. You can think back to some of the people that you have been persuaded by in your life, and how have those individuals established expertise, trustworthiness, and goodwill, right? So these are all things to think about, and certainly things that you want to try to cultivate in your persuasive campaigns. Social attractiveness. Social attractiveness is another important part of a speaker source issue that influences persuasiveness. People who are socially attractive tend to be perceived by the audience or by a listener as likable. So they're seen as nice. They're seen as appealing individuals. They make us feel good, okay? Or they make the audience feel good. They may also put us in a good mood. So this is where we can attempt to use things like compliments or humor or having a dialogue with the audience, things like that, okay? Those are all things that can enhance social attractiveness. And people who are more socially attractive tend to also be better persuaders. So this is not very surprising, but it's still good to point that out. Again, people who are socially attractive also tend to be perceived as individuals who have goodwill for the audience or goodwill for society in general. So anything that we can do to work to cultivate a perception of social attractiveness in our audience is something that we would like to work on in our own persuasive ability. Social attractiveness also deals with perceptions of similarity between the speaker and the audience. So, generally speaking, those people who we perceive to be similar to us are also more persuasive to us, okay? This makes sense. So if we perceive that somebody has a very similar life as us, or we think that we have things in common with them, we're probably more likely to think that what they're saying may ring true for us, and we're more likely to trust them, okay? And this is especially relevant to a certain message that might be particularly salient or important to us, right? So in terms of similarity, one thing that we can do is we can work to attempt to bring forth some of the similarities that we may have with the audience, right? And this is why it's always a good thing to try to gauge your audience before you develop and deliver any kind of a persuasive campaign, right? Because if you can work to try to develop perceptions of similarity, you're much more likely to be persuasive. And this is especially relevant in terms of the message, whether this message is something that, or this topic is something that is important or relevant for the audience as well. People who we perceive to be similar to ourselves tend to also promote a more positive affect or emotional response in their audience. So if I perceive that a speaker has a lot of similarities in terms of their values and their lifestyle as I do, I'm more likely to view their attitudes and their stance with a positive perception and with a more of a positive attitude. I'm more likely to be receptive to the persuasive message that they're attempting to deliver. In addition, perceptions of similarity also promote more positive cognitions. So if I think that someone is similar to me, I'm more likely to have cognitive thoughts or responses to their message that will promote more persuasiveness. So remember, you think back to the previous chapter where we talked about one of the models that looked at how human beings have internal cognitions, right? And some of the cognitions were pro cognitions and some of them were anti thoughts. So any kind of pro message thoughts, anti message thoughts, right? So pro message thoughts, positive cognitions, are more likely to play out if you're able to establish perceptions of similarity with your audience. Now, in terms of similarity, you don't actually have to be that similar to your audience to work to cultivate a perception of similarity, right? You may have a different age status as your audience. Perhaps you're maybe in a different political affiliation as your audience. You may have different perceptions of, what kind of lifestyle choices are preferable. But I think that one thing we can always come back to is our similarity as human beings, right? And so all of us have hopes and dreams in our lives. All of us have desires and things that we want to accomplish. All of us know what it's like to be on the receiving end of communication that is loving and supportive as compared to communication that is hostile and non-supportive, right? All of us can agree, for the most part, that we want to experience love in life and that we want to experience joy and accomplishment. And these are very common human traits, right? All of us want to see our families and friends be happy and healthy and things like that. So even if you are looking out at an audience or you're delivering a presentation or a speech to a group of people that you think you have nothing in common with, you can always go back to the human equation and the human similarities that we all share, and you can still work to cultivate perceptions of attractiveness and similarity by referencing those types of similar human values, even if it doesn't appear on the surface as if you have a lot of similarities. The final component of attractiveness is physical attractiveness. So obviously social attractiveness has these three components, and the third of those being physical attractiveness, right? So now physically attractive people, not surprisingly, also tend to be more persuasive, okay? We like to look at and listen to people who we perceive to be attractive. So this is something certainly to file away. Now, although we can't actually influence what we look like physically, we can do things to make ourselves look more attractive in terms of stylizing our, dress or our attire. We can make ourselves appear more attractive by how we carry ourselves. We can do things like, other types of grooming behaviors that can make you look more attractive with hair or nails or things like that. So there are lots of things that people can do to give off an attractive air, right? Even if they don't consider themselves to be that attractive physically. It's not a surprise probably that people who are more attractive tend to get more attention, and this is something that also plays out with persuasion and with audiences. So we tend to pay closer attention when someone is easy on the eyes, right? And it's something that is a very human tendency. I don't think this is very surprising, but it's certainly worth covering. We tend to also identify more with people who are attractive. This is kind of an interesting human tendency. It may have something to do with this idea of the power of affiliation. So, if I have friends or if I affiliate or identify with people who are attractive, then me, myself, I perhaps may also be able to take on some of those attractiveness cues, or maybe I might be seen as more attractive if I have friends or people who I interact with that are attractive. This could be something that would explain why we identify more with people who are attractive. Also, we tend to associate more attractive people with a message more favorably, okay? So when we see someone who's attractive and they're giving us a message on persuasion, then we're more likely to say, oh yeah, well, I like looking at you. I'm going to pay more attention with you or to you because you're attractive. I identify more with you because you're nice to look at, and I want to identify with attractive people. And so what does that mean in terms of the message? Well, it means that I'm going to associate the attractiveness or the feelings of what it feels like to be interacting with an attractive person with the actual message that they're delivering. So this is why, for example, you don't tend to see very many plain spokespeople, right? Most of the people who are doing advertisements for any number of products or services in our society, they tend to be good-looking people. They tend to be younger, unless they're doing ads for, you know, life insurance or mortgage, reverse mortgage things, or, you know, various things like that. But this is one of the reasons why the advertising industry knows that they want to have attractive people who are their spokes individuals, okay? So not surprising, but it's still worth looking at and being conscious of, especially in terms of our own persuadability, right? So how much am I being persuaded by the message of this person versus how nice they are to look at, okay? So with all this discussion on attractiveness, let's look at some situations when attractiveness actually helps. Well, attractiveness helps capture attention. We already know this. Attractiveness also helps in situations where people are not as involved in the actual situation. So remember, thinking back to elaboration likelihood model in the previous chapter, those people who are less involved in the issue tend to process messages in a peripheral way, right? So this is a very similar situation. When I'm not as involved in the situation, if there's an attractive spokesperson, I'm more likely to listen because it's not something that's really that central to my identity or central to who I am as a person. Attractiveness also helps when linked with a product. Okay, this is why many of the people who are spokes individuals for corporations or for products tend to be good looking and young and fit and stylized in an attractive way and all these things. And attractiveness helps when it violates an expectation. So what does this mean? Well, I think that there's a really interesting example on page 179 of your book. The middle section here talks about the story of Rebecca Armstrong, who was a former Playboy playmate who contracted HIV from having intercourse with a male model. Okay, after years of suffering, drug abuse, and denying the situation, Armstrong went public with her story to try to teach young people about the dangers of unprotected sex. So when you think about her effectiveness, right, you think about this beautiful model, she's a Playboy model, right? Your image or your blueprint or schema of what a Playboy model should look like or should be doesn't include her as someone who has HIV or AIDS, right? So because it disconfirms an expectation, then you have to think about it, right, and process it, and then you have to sort of reorganize things mentally. So presumably, when a person listens to an attractive model like Armstrong talk, what a person would discover then, and this is where the violating expectation happens, what you discover is that she's actually arguing for this position not because of her knowledge or because she has some bias, but because she truly believes that people need to take precautions against AIDS. And so when attractive communicators do or say things that are unexpected, that don't seem to be in alignment with their good looks or their attractiveness, then these actual situations can be assumed to be taking place because of inner convictions or some kind of an inner knowing or, attempt to try to help people, okay? So I think that's a really interesting example, especially when connected with the violating expectation component. Now, attractiveness does not always help, so let's look at some of the things that will not be influenced or different persuasion situations that are not going to be helped by attractiveness. Attractiveness does not help with deeply felt attitudes, okay? So you can think back again to the elaboration likelihood model, and people who are highly involved in an issue or they feel very strongly about the issue, they're going to be processing things in a central way, not a peripheral way, right? So deeply felt attitudes do not tend to be influenced when the person is highly attractive. This could be with regards to issues like capital punishment, religion, any number of topics that you feel strongly about would apply here. It also would not help probably when there's a violation of a role expectation. So you're going to the doctor, you're expecting to, see some guy in a lab coat, right? Because of many of our socializations and expectations. And you walk in and instead you see a really beautiful, stylized, made up Barbie looking model, okay, in a white lab coat, okay? So according to this perspective, because there's a violation of a role expectation, because we wouldn't expect a female doctor to be so stylized and so beautiful, that actually would not help her in terms of her persuadability with us. And finally, it's definitely worth pointing out that although attractiveness does capture someone's attention in the short term, attractiveness in terms of this persuasive impact is fairly short-lived. Knowledge and reporting biases are important to be aware of, and we also want to be conscious of how these kinds of issues not only influence our own ability to be persuaded, but also influence our ability to persuade other people. So the knowledge bias deals with an assumption that a source or a given speaker has a biased view of an issue. Now, I've mentioned this before in this chapter, but generally speaking, most people or most persuasive sources do have an agenda and do have a bias. So it's good to be aware of that going into our own speeches that we might be delivering in this class or in another public or professional setting. Generally speaking, it's a good idea to work to present the information in a way where it does not appear that you are very biased. And the reason for this is that if you appear as if you're very biased towards a particular outcome, then you may actually decrease credibility and perceptions of trustworthiness because it looks as if you're really trying to, promote some kind of an agenda. However, as people who are being persuaded on a daily basis in society and by the media and by other people in our lives and groups, it's very important to be aware of the fact that the knowledge bias is something that takes place. It's very difficult for people to be totally neutral on any number of issues. And so chances are probably more likely than not that if you're listening to a speech or if you're listening to a presentation or if you're watching an advertisement or something like that, that there is obviously a bias in one direction or the other, okay? Another thing that we want to be conscious of in terms of our own ability to be persuaded and also our ability to persuade other people is a reporting bias. A reporting bias takes place when there's a failure to disclose certain facts or points of view. So sometimes you might have a reporting bias that takes place on certain types of news stations, okay, where certain types of news stations might only represent certain types of point of views, and they might minimize or not represent other points of views at all. You may also have reporting biases in newspaper articles about certain topics, okay? Obviously, depending on where the newspaper is based and what kind of a political background or affiliation that newspaper source or that news station source may have affiliations with, sometimes these kinds of reporting biases can actually take place quite regularly. So this is another reason why it's very good for us as consumers to always question the information that we receive, to always go looking for information on our own to confirm the information that has been reported to us. And generally speaking, it's good as a persuader to avoid trying to hammer your own bias or hammer your own agenda when you're presenting something. And generally, it's a good idea also to include different points of view or different facts that may not be in support of your actual stance on an issue, but the ability to include the different points of view and the different information actually will enhance your credibility and your persuadability because the audience will perceive that you are more trustworthy because you are not withholding information, but in fact, you are going to present the information and then tell the audience why it is that that information, although it may be true, why it is that they should still come over to your side of the fence in terms of the persuasive topic. So we're going to talk more about this idea of acknowledging the opposing viewpoints in the next chapter, which is dealing with message factors. But for the end of this chapter, I just really want us to be aware of the fact that we live in a society that is full of biases. Most of the persuasive attempts that take place have a bias, obviously, and it's good to be aware of the fact that there are often facts or information that are not presented in a deliberate attempt to persuade us to a certain viewpoint, belief, or behavior. And certainly, as educated consumers and as critical thinkers, We always want to work to seek out that information so that we can actually make informed decisions instead of decisions that are based on information that is largely one-sided and incomplete. Applying source factors to your own persuasive communication campaigns and in your professional and personal lives. When you're giving a public speech or some kind of a persuasive speech or developing a campaign, you definitely need to have technical knowledge about the topic. Also, you want to convey to your audience what that technical knowledge is. So it's generally a good idea at the beginning of a speech to reference either your education or your training or your experience with the topic, okay? However, you do not want to talk about it so much that the audience starts to think that you're full of yourself, okay? So you do want to reference it so that they are able to see you as a credible source, but you do not want to stand up there and talk about yourself and what you did and how important it was so long that the audience starts to gloss over, right? Their eyes start to gloss over and you've lost them. You do not want to do that because remember, not only are you attempting to persuade the audience that you're a credible source, but you also want to persuade them that you're likable, right? Now, if you do not have that much technical knowledge about a topic, like let's say you're new in an organization or you're just starting out studying something, a given area of study or research, you definitely do not want to tell your audience at the beginning of the talk, I don't know very much about this, so I'm just going to try to do my best and I hope that you guys learn something, right? That's definitely not something you want to say. The best thing you can do in order to establish yourself as a credible source, even if you do not have that much technical knowledge about the topic, is you can do your homework. You can find out what are other people saying who give a speech that's similar to this speech. What kinds of speeches have come in the past that have addressed this topic and what did they talk about? You definitely never want to stand up in front of an audience without being prepared on the topic, okay? Because your audience will know. They can tell when you're up there flubbing or trying to stall or trying to, make something sound like it makes sense when it doesn't, okay? So having technical knowledge about the topic is important. It's also important to convey that to your audience early on so that you can establish credibility. The second thing we need to do is we need to show our audience that we care about the topic and we care about our role as a persuader. Goodwill goes a long way. So how do we demonstrate to the audience that we care about this topic? Well, one thing you can do early on is you can introduce the experiences that you've had where you first learned about the topic, or perhaps there was a pivotal turning point in your life where you realized that this issue was very important and you decided to commit yourself to trying to promote that interest, okay? You can tell a short story at the beginning about why it is you care about the topic and why it is that you're trying to persuade people to do something that's going to be a benefit somehow to society in a broader way. The third thing that you can do in terms of establishing yourself as a good source is try to get the audience to like you. So you want to enhance the likable parts of your personality and minimize the parts of your personality that are not so likable. So for some of us, we tend to be really gregarious and outgoing and extroverted, right? So we could play that up in a speech a little bit. On the other hand, some of us tend to be more calm and serene, and so that might be something that you could weave into your presentation, okay? Generally speaking, you can also try to use humor as a way to enhance the likable parts of your personality. A couple of tips on using humor. One of the first tips that you should probably be aware of with humor is that humor is very culturally varied. So what that means is what one audience might find very funny, another audience will not find funny at all. And so this is why it's important to know your audience prior to giving the speech so that you can try to tailor your comments or your jokes so that they might find them humorous. Another tip on using humor is that humor should only be done in a way where you're not targeting members of the audience. So generally, you want to probably use humor with regards to topics that are more general or out there. You never want to target a specific member of the audience or collectively, crack a joke about the audience or what they look like today or something like that, okay? You can also use self-effacing humor to a limited degree. Generally speaking, if you're going to use humor, it's always better to use self-effacing humor where you put yourself down just a little bit. On the other hand, if you do too much self-effacing humor, the audience will start to get really uncomfortable because they might start to think that you have low self-esteem. And so if you're going to use humor, you really have to be kind of careful about it. Humor is not 100%. However, humor is something that can really work to enhance likability. So if you can figure out how to create a good rapport with the audience early on, you're probably more likely to get them to find you humorous later on in the speech. This is where we come to the rapport idea. So at the beginning of the speech, if you haven't already been able to chat with people in the audience before you deliver the speech, once you start the speech, it's good to develop some rapport with the audience by asking them things like, so, how are we all doing today? You know, are we all getting ready for this event? And oh, are we getting our shopping done for the holidays or this and that, right? How many of us wish we had another couple of hours to sleep this morning? Can I see a show of hands, right? You get people to participate and raise their hand, right? Things like that. So if you haven't had a chance to find out about the audience before the actual speech, then you should work to try to develop some rapport by finding that out once the speech begins. Developing rapport with your audience is very important, and it's something that will go a long way in terms of your ability to persuade them and in terms of their willingness to stay with you as a speaker, okay? Now, getting the audience to like you and enhancing likability and keeping rapport going with the audience is not just about asking them the right questions and about cracking the right jokes. It's also about keeping the connection with the audience. And what do we mean by keeping the connection? Well, one thing that you absolutely never want to do is get up and give a speech and read your speech from a paper, or get up with your note cards and read your note cards. When you start to read the speech from note cards or the PowerPoint presentation or a piece of paper, guess what happens with your audience? You lose them. They tune out. So it's absolutely essential that you work on memorizing your speech well enough so that all you need to jog your memory are a couple of key phrases for every type of transition that you're going to do, right? You have maybe your key phrase on the PowerPoint. You already know what you're going to say. You don't have to be reading it at all. And this also enhances your credibility, doesn't it? I don't know about you, but if somebody stands up to give a speech and they have to read the information, it doesn't make me believe that they really know the information very well, right? So not only do you want to not read your speech, but you want to keep the eye contact going with the audience, right? So when you start to talk to them in the beginning and you're going to be bantering back and developing some rapport with them a little bit before you start the speech, you want to keep the eye contact going. You want to keep your connection with the audience throughout the entire speech, all right? It's very important to be able to see how the audience is responding to what you say. This is something that I did a lot when I was lecturing in person, okay? Nowadays, I do my lectures on narrated PowerPoints, but I can tell you that one of the reasons it's very important to keep eye contact with people is it keeps them alert, right? You can make eye contact with someone in the back row and ask the question, and they'll nod to you and say, yeah, I know what you're talking about, right? And you want to give eye contact equally to the entire audience. You don't want to just look at one or two people because it starts to make them feel very uncomfortable, right? So if you're keeping the connection going with the audience, then you're going to be able to gauge whether they're hearing what you're saying, whether they're confused by what you said. If you say something and all of a sudden people start to look very confused, then you can work to repackage the same idea in a different way. Or if you start to see people looking away or getting uncomfortable or shaking their heads like they disagree with you, then you can tune in and ask, you could ask a question. What do you folks think? Do you agree with this or not? And then you can address any areas of disagreement they might have while you're actually giving the speech, rather than having them walk away and leave without actually embracing the message that you're trying to convey. Attractiveness. Now, obviously, we have all been born with the body we have, okay? We are all who we are as people, and so everybody has their own look and their own sort of persona in the world. So in terms of physical attractiveness, there's not an incredible amount that most of us can do in terms of making yourself really, really attractive if you're just kind of normal looking, right? And by the way, most of us are normal looking, right? However, there is a lot that you can do to enhance your perception of attractiveness by other people in terms of how you stylize yourself. So, people who are attractive, even if they aren't a 10 on the scale, all right, people who are attractive tend to be stylized well in terms of how they're dressed. They tend to wear clothing that enhances the positive aspects of their body and minimizes the negative aspects of their body, okay? They also tend to wear colors that are good with their color skin or their different, hair color or their eyes or their, skin shade or things like that. Also, you can carry yourself in a way where you look attractive. You can carry yourself with a straight posture. You can carry yourself with confidence, right? You can minimize the use of nervous, nonverbal cues that make your audience members think that you're insecure or not sure of yourself. You can also do a lot in terms of how you stylize yourself with grooming. You can do things with your hair. You can do things potentially with your nails or with things like accessories, or maybe, if you're into wearing makeup, you can wear makeup or whatever else makes you feel confident, okay? So there are many things that we can do to make ourselves look groomed and attractive, and you definitely want to enhance that aspect of yourself, because remember, people are not only buying the message, they're buying you as a source when they agree to adopt an attitude, a belief, or a behavior, okay? So attractiveness is something that we can all work on. You want to enhance it, but you do not want to play it up too much. You certainly do not want to get up and give a speech in front of people and have it look like you spent hours and hours and hours trying to look attractive, right? So in some ways, less is more with attractiveness. And in addition, you also want to make sure that you don't use accessories or symbols when you dress yourself that could be distracting or that could exclude people, right? So generally speaking, when you give a speech, you want to try to stylize yourself in a way where people are not able to figure out or conclude major things about your personality just based on, let's say, the jewelry you wear, or based on a tattoo that you have in a very visible position, right? Or based on, other things that some people might find sort of questionable in terms of whether they want to believe you as a credible source, okay? So generally speaking, there's lots of things we can do to enhance our source credibility, our authority, and of course our social attractiveness and our goodwill and things like that. Have technical knowledge about the topic, but don't ever apologize to the audience at the beginning of the speech and tell them you don't really know very much. Just fake it till you make it, right? And of course, do your homework, which is more important than faking it, right? You show the audience that you care about the topic. Talk about why it is that you're interested in this issue. What kind of experience did you have that led you to get involved in this topic? You want to try to be likable to the personality. You want to enhance the likable parts of your personality and downplay the parts of your personality that some people tend to be turned off by, right? You definitely want to keep that rapport going with the audience, which of course begins when you find out as much as possible about them in terms of their tastes, attitudes, and what they know or don't know about the issue. And finally, you want to work to stylize yourself in a way that you are attractive. You want to enhance attractiveness. There's a lot that all of us can do to make ourselves look like we're professional, attractive individuals, even if we tend to be more normal looking, which, by the way, most of us are normal looking, which is why it's called normal, right? Okay, I'm going to conclude this speech at this point and conclude this chapter. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope that you did find useful information in this chapter, and I will talk to everyone in the next chapter. Have an excellent day.